Well, good morning, everybody. It is good that you're here. I almost said it's good to see you this morning. Well, it's me, it's Jason, and we're jumping into our study here, 1 Samuel chapter 21, 22. I encourage you to grab your Bibles, grab your devices, get to the kitchen table if you're not already there, or to your couch or your big comfy chair with your coffee or juice or whatever you've got, and let's dig into God's Word. I think it's going to be really impactful in our lives today. David and Saul, that's 1 Samuel, the part that we're in right now. They're going to be the key characters all the way to the end of 1 Samuel. But David and Saul are headed in different directions, totally different directions. And we're going to see that coming out in the text. You know, as Christians, we are God-honoring. God is our center. He's our focus. Everything we're trying to do in our words and our actions are just try to lift Him up. And so we're going to see in our text today that one guy is totally walking towards God, and the other guy's he's walking away from God. Their attitudes, their actions, their behaviors, you're going to see that. So kind of start making a mental list here, because we're really going to see it. We've seen some in the chapters before, but we're really going to see it. In fact, from here on out, it becomes really obvious the difference between the two. So go ahead and start making a mental note. If you've got notes and a pen and paper, go ahead and start writing some things down, because I think that's going to make a big difference in our walk today. You know, I got to thinking about trying to put myself in David's shoes. And so I kind of want us to do that for just a moment. When we think about where David's been to where he is now, right? We're about to step into chapter 21 when he officially starts running, right? But you think about where he's been. He was anointed at a young age to be the king over all his older brothers. He killed Goliath. He became a big part of Saul's royal court. He became this mighty warrior. There's the song, you know, that's been sung about him. In fact, we're going to hear it in our study today that Saul had killed his thousands, but David had killed his 10,000s. I mean, this is huge. David had all this promise. God said, all these things are going to happen. You're going to be my guy. And yet here he is at the beginning of chapter 21, totally on the run. You got to know that he's thinking somewhere in the back of his mind, he's going, this is not where I want to be. This is not how I thought things were going to go. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in a situation where you thought, Lord, this isn't how I saw this thing going, right? Is this what you meant by following you, that all these things were going to happen? And so I really think David's story relates to us. His story is really our story. So I hope that you really hang in here and apply some of the things that we're going to learn about what people should do, and maybe about what some things that we shouldn't be doing in our Christian walk, right? So 1 Samuel chapter 21, chapter 20 ends. We see arrows being shot at the end of chapter 20. Final farewells are being said. Jonathan heads back to Gibeah. But the text says that David he left. He went away. And the fact is that Jonathan had a place to go. But now, David, officially on his own in exile, and he's in desperate need to escape because Saul is there trying to get him and to kill him. In chapter 21, we're introduced to three characters. You're going to want to pay attention to these three guys. They play big roles. Some of them play roles in chapters to come as well. We see Ahimelech, the priest. We see Doeg, D-O-E-G, the Edomite. And we see Achish, one of the kings of Gath there in Philistia. So chapter 21 opens up. David finally, he takes off, and the text says that he's going to run to Nob, the city of Nob, where Ahimelech, the priest, is. Now, Nob is about 2.5 miles southeast of Gibeah. And Gibeah is Saul's headquarters. So he hightails it out of there. Now, there's something we got to know about Ahimelech, a little bit of background, just real quickly. Ahimelech the priest is the son of Ahitub, who's the son of Phinehas, who is the son of Eli the priest. Ping, ping, ping. We know Eli the priest. That should ring some bells for you, right? Good old Eli the priest. We know him. We know his story. And so here we are, all these years after the death of Eli and his sons, and their priestly responsibilities are now continued on by Ahimelech, Eli's great-grandson, and the 85 surviving members of that priestly family. Here we see, I think, our first big teaching point, and this is vitally important for us to consider. You can learn a lot about a person by seeing where they turn to in times of trouble. Where do you turn to when things get crazy? That's a good question for us to consider here. Again, in the back of our mind, we've got this list going. We've got people that are walking towards, we've got one guy that's walking towards God and one guy that's walking away. And notice which ones they start turning to. Where do they start turning to in this fact? Earlier, we see when trouble starts coming up with David, he runs to Samuel at Ramah. He can't protect him at Ramah, so David goes back to Gibeah and he seeks counsel with Jonathan, his good friend. And now here he is seeking help from Ahimelech. So we've got Samuel, good godly man, Jonathan, a good God follower, and now we've got Ahimelech, the voice of God, God's voice person, right? You can see where he's going, who he's looking to for support and backing. All right, that's important for us to notice here. David is officially on the run, and so he needs food, he needs shelter, and he needs weapon. And so that's why he goes to Ahimelech. He knows that he can get what he needs there. So when he gets there to Nob, Ahimelech asks him, hey, David, what are you doing here? And David says that, hey, I'm on this secret errand for the king, but I want you, please don't tell anybody why I'm here. We start to notice some of the military tactics that David is using. We'll especially see it in these two chapters that we're going to be talking about today, but especially in the next few weeks. David starts doing some things tactically, and so kind of pay attention to those. He says, don't tell anybody about that. I don't want anybody to know that I'm here. But Ahimelech says, hey, as for food, we don't have any regular food here. We've got some showbread, or what the text calls in the NAS, the bread of the presence. Now, this bread was placed in the tabernacle each week. It was considered holy and really intended only for the priest to eat. But Ahimelech agrees to bend the rules this one time because he wants to help out David. All right? Ahimelech also gives David a weapon. And if you notice there in the text, I think this is pretty cool. He gives David the weapon that he used to cut off Goliath's head. Wow. Didn't know, even though that thing was still around, didn't know that David already had it. Ahimelech had it. The priest had it in Nob. So you can imagine as he puts that sword back in his hands, as he sees that sword, what he begins to remember. I think this is kind of a neat, interesting point here, right? The things that he begins to remember. Lisa and I have started watching this show on Netflix called The Repair Shop. It's a really cool show. It's a British show, and people bring in their old antique furniture and watches and vases, clocks, and it's really neat. The beginning of the show is you bring it in and you talk about the background. The middle of the show is them fixing it, and at the very end, the people come back. And these things are fixed. Especially this last show that we saw really kind of almost seemed to be centered around the grandparent or the granddad. This one woman got back this clock that was her granddad's, and now as she places it nice and new and clean and fixed on her wall, it reminds her of her dad. and the conversations they used to have and the love that they had and what that meant to them. So this is the same kind of thing. David puts that sword in his hands. He puts it in its sheath, or he carries it, and he remembers the last time he used it. And the protection that God gave him, the strength that God gave him, the backing that God gave him. So here he is, he's on the run, he's needing support, and he's got this sword, gives him some encouragement. I think that's an interesting note there. Verse 7 is kind of an odd verse. It's just kind of tucked in there. It's kind of a standalone verse, and then we don't hear about it for a little while. We're introduced to a very interesting character, this guy Doeg, D-O-E-G, the Edomite. It simply says that he is Saul's chief shepherd and that he was there in Nob, and he saw the whole thing. He saw where Ahimelech helped David with some food and some shelter and the sword. And then that's it. We don't hear about him until the next chapter. So simply take him, put him up there in the corner, and we'll come back to him here in just a little bit. At the end of chapter 21, David takes off. He's on the run, remember? So this time he goes to a little town in the Philistine territory. Now you got to get your mental map on here. There's actually two encampments or two nations of the Philistines. There's one down south and there's one way up north near Damascus, up in that area. This is the one down south, all right? So he runs over there, and what he's kind of hoping here is that maybe he can get some political asylum. Maybe he can go there and be unknown or unnoticed. Also, he's going into enemy territory, so he's thinking maybe Saul won't follow me there. Again, we're starting to see some of these military tactics that he's starting to use. He'll do this a lot. In fact, he'll do it again here in the next chapter. All right? But this doesn't work because some of the men, some of the soldiers there in Philistine territory in the city of Gath recognize him. And they know this song about David, that Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s. It kind of shows us how well known that David is. And so this makes a big impression upon him, and he starts going, man, I can't just go anywhere. I can't just do anything. And so I've got to be smart about this. So David does something interesting. The text says that he starts acting crazy, like he's insane. Because he knows, hey, if I get caught, these guys recognize me. I'm in trouble. I'm going to end up getting killed, captured, whatever. My family's going to end up being in danger. And so he starts acting like an insane person. And the king, Achish, the king of Gath there, we kind of start getting a good feel for him. He's a little naive here. And he goes, no, I don't need another crazy guy. And he doesn't pay any attention to David. And it works. His tactic works. So we see David hightail it out of there at the end of chapter 21. And so at the beginning of chapter 22, we see him going to the caves of Adullam. And I had some cool pictures of those. I'll show them to you next week, where they think they know exactly the caves. And it's real interesting when we think about a cave. If you've ever gone spelunking or anything like that, think about these real narrow crevices that aren't very big, but these just happen to open up into chambers and little tunnels that lead to bigger chambers where groups of people, large groups, hundreds of people could go and hide. And so here David is, he's heading off to that place. All right? The text says there at the beginning of chapter 22 that David's family joins him. Now, we got to remember this from history, not only from Bible history, but from ancient history, from British history. Are you in danger if you're a king or a prince? Boy, you are. Because if anybody wants to raise a rebellion and take over, not only do they come after you, the king or the prince, to kill you, but they also come after you to kill your family as well. So nobody has the right to say, no, I'm king. And so what they tend to do is then just wipe out the whole family. So I think there's a little bit of that going on here. Maybe David called them to him saying, hey, your life is in danger. Come stay with me. Maybe that was part of it. Maybe they just came to David because they were being threatened or whatever, right? So we got David's family joining him in the hiding in these caves. All right? The text then begins to say also that all those who were discontented, who were in debt, who were distressed, came to be with him as well. About 400 men, not counting women, not counting older people, not counting the children. 400 men, the text says, were there once everybody came. It's interesting, it's from these men that David starts first forming his army. We know the mighty men of David, and this is kind of the origin story of where these guys are coming from, right? Those mighty men came from this original 400 men that came to form with him, right? So David decides then, starting in verse 3, he decides, okay, I've got to do something here. We've got to remember David's military, his tactics, and his overall plan. David's just not aimlessly wandering around. He's got some idea of what he's doing here. He knows, I've got to sneak around, I've got to be quick, I've got to be fast. He also knows I've got a little job to do. I'm going to go start defeating some of and warring against some of the tribes that are going against Israel. And with my family here, they're going to slow me down. I've got women, I've got children, I've got older people, and they're going to slow me down. And I've got to move quickly, and they're not going to be able to do that. So what David does, he again decides to do this really cool military tactic thing. He goes all the way over to the east, into the country of Moab, and he leaves his mom and dad and his family over there for protection. So you got to be thinking about this. Saul's not going to chase him over there. He's not going to bring the army over into Moab. Why? Because that would be a big war with Moab, right? So he takes them over there. There's this really cool connection that David has with Moab. His dad is Jesse. Jesse's a grandson of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite, right? So there's a little bit of connection there, and maybe he uses that connection because the king there and the city of Moab simply says, yeah, they can stay there. David and some of his men, his military men, then go back to the forest of Harith, which is not far from Gibeah, and they stay there in the stronghold. All right. We now see that the scene turns to Saul. He is there in Gibeah, and he is showing this scene of power, right? He's got his spear with him, which is a show of power. He's on a high hill. He's in the holy royal city, and he's got all of his lieutenants around him. Totally a scene of power, right? Yet I want us to be sure and notice what the author of 1 Samuel is trying to do in this contrast. He's trying to show a comparison here. Saul thinks he's got power, yet Saul is completely powerless. He's powerless to capture David, right? No matter his outrageous tactics, he's not going to catch him, right? God's not going to let this happen, right? And so it's significant here also who Saul has around him. He speaks of the Benjaminites, his own little tribe. Right? It would be wise if a king were to unite the whole nation of Israel, to have people from all tribes, but all he's got, verse 7, all he's got is his guys from his little tribe. In verse 7 and 8, we really see King Saul kind of losing it here. See his demented thoughts, his evil thoughts are really coming out. In chapter 7, he's like, Why hasn't anybody told me? Why hasn't anybody warned me about where David is hiding? Why hasn't anybody told me why my son is partnering with David and in scheming his escape, right? Don't you know if David was king that he wouldn't treat you the way that I'm treating you? Do you think that he would make you a leader over hundreds or thousands like I have? It's interesting what they say in verse 8. Let's take a look at that in chapter 22. Let's read verse 7 and verse 8. This is real interesting. And Saul said to his servants who stood around him, "Hear now, O Benjamites, will the son of Jesse also give to all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands, commanders of hundreds?" Look at this, verse 8. "For all of you have conspired against me, so that there is no one who discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. And there is none of you who is sorry for me and discloses to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in ambush as it is this day." This is interesting. No one has warned me. You know why no one had warned him? Because there was no warning necessary. What had David done except to be faithful and honorable, right? No one speaks up because they knew that King Saul was making these things up. It was his own creation of his evil imagination. And so in verse 8 it says, in verse 9 it says that Doeg, the Edomite that we saw a while ago, who was there in Nob, is there with King Saul, and he speaks up. And he says, "Hey, King Saul, I'll tell you where he is. Just a while ago, not too many days ago, he was in Nob with Ahimelech, and Ahimelech helped him, gave him food, gave him shelter, gave him a weapon." And this just launches Saul into this tirade. He is so enraged. I think he knew beforehand what was going to happen. And so he calls Ahimelech and all the priests to him, and he asks Ahimelech, hey, what's going on here? Have you helped? What have you done? Have you been helping David? Why did you do this? Now look at verse 14. Here is Ahimelech's answer. Again, notice this contrast between these two men here in verse 14. Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David? Even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard and is honored in your house." Now, what are you thinking, King Saul? You know, it's almost this implied, man, you're out of your mind. Don't you know that David is faithful? He's family to you. He's been in your house all this time. Has he done anything wrong? Has he dishonored you in any way? And of course, the answer to all that is no, right? He's been good to you. You can almost see that question. So why are you after him, right? Why are you after him? Saul is enraged, doesn't see clearly. Again, we're seeing this contrast between someone who's walking towards God and someone who's walking away. He's not making sense here. He doesn't want to see reason, doesn't want to listen to reason. And so Saul says, he turns to his guards and says, "Hey, I want you guys to kill Ahimelech and all these priests." And they say no. They're not going to do it, which is a sign. If you're the king and some of your men are not obeying you, there's a sign there, Saul. You need to check that out. So he turns to Doeg, the Edomite. "Doeg, you kill him," and he does. He kills Ahimelech, and he kills the rest of that family. Except one. Verses 20 through 23 tell us that Abiathar, one of the sons of Ahimelech, actually gets away, and he goes to David. And he tells David everything that has happened. Here's another interesting contrast between King Saul and David. When David hears this story, he takes on the responsibility. It was my decision to go to Ahimelech. I caused his death and the death of that family. And he feels the remorse for that, feeling like he had done it, when in reality, we know who really killed them, right? It was King Saul. Now, this is an interesting point here about the power and the might and the faithfulness of God that we see happening here. When King Saul had Ahimelech killed and all the priests killed, with that comes the fulfillment of a prophecy made in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 31 through 36, which spoke of the cutting off of every man of yours from my altar. Now, God there in that text in 1 Kings 2, God was talking to Eli the priest. You see, his sons had done some things. His sons had got out of control, and so he was telling Eli, you have let your boys do some things that were dishonorable to me. I'm going to cut you off from the priesthood. Here is God fulfilling that prophecy from way back, from many years earlier, is being fulfilled right here in this chapter with King Saul killing Ahimelech on all the priests. There's an interesting connection here that the author wants us to see. That's God's faithfulness, right? God's faithfulness, that He's going to do what He says He's going to do. So here's the underlying principle with this. David is here, chapter 21, 22. He's being chased. He was anointed long ago. He killed King David. He's the killer of this mighty warrior, killing 10,000s. And yet at this time he's being chased, and maybe he's got these questions about who he's to be and is God still going to be with him? If God is faithful, here's the point of this, if God is faithful in His prophecy to fulfill it, from way back in 1 Kings chapter 2, then God's also going to be faithful in making him king, right? Just like he was anointed to be. He's going to also be faithful to David and make him king, right? Saul, in his desperate grasping after power and his dependence upon human power structures, is a pathetic and doomed figure here. His paranoia and his suspicion have isolated his officers. And his obsession with David has now cost the lives of Ahimelech. But in contrast, David has turned to a familiar faith of his childhood in this time of crisis, and has sought help from his priests, from prophets, and from friends. Saul and David are traveling in opposite directions. That's how we started our class, right? The reader gets the impression that in both cases that God will fulfill His word to both of them, just as now God is fulfilling His word concerning Eli's family. All right? So here's the big point, guys. God's word is certain and true. God's word is certain and true. You can count on it. He is faithful. The question I asked earlier, just like David, maybe it is that you're wondering, man, how did I get here? What's going on? I didn't plan for this to be happening. This is not what I thought. Just like David, we're beginning to see if that we'll just stay with God, if we'll remain faithful to Him, knowing that He's going to have our back, that He's going to build our confidence, He's going to give us what we need to endure. If we'll walk towards Him like David is walking towards Him, He's going to give us what we need. All right? So that's my study for today. Go ahead and read the next couple of chapters. We'll probably cover the next 3 chapters next week. Thanks for the study, guys. Look forward to seeing you soon. Bye-bye.